Good evening. It's April 28th, 2017. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our Friday evening LaRouchePAC webcast here on LaRouchePAC.com. I'm joined in the studio today by a special guest, Mike Billington from Executive Intelligence Review magazine. And we've invited Mike to come in today because of the extraordinary nature of the current strategic situation. Now, obviously, we are 2 weeks out from the very significant Belt and Road Summit that's happening in Beijing, China, on May 13th and May 14th. So, exactly 2 weeks from tomorrow. And we have several dozen heads of state from countries around the world that have confirmed that they are, in fact, attending. As we reported, Vladimir Putin was invited as the guest of honor, the president of Russia, to attend the Belt and Road Summit. And we continue our call for President Donald Trump to attend that summit as a featured guest and to use that as his opportunity to reciprocate President Xi Jinping's offer that the United States join the new paradigm of development and peace, which is represented by the Belt and Road, or the New Silk Road. Now, obviously, we are in the midst of a fight for the soul of the United States, for the soul of the U.S. presidency, and we see that fight heating up over the question, whither the United States, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche titled the recent Schiller Institute conference in New York City, whither the United States, New Silk Road, or nuclear war. And what has occurred over the last month since the very ill-advised strikes that the Trump administration ordered against Syria is that it's come out into the open that there is, in fact, a British-led attempted coup that's being run in the United States against the Trump administration. The context of that are the lies, the intelligence fabrications that have come out of British intelligence and have been bulldozed onto President Trump, much in the way that Tony Blair used the lies about weapons of mass destruction in 2003 to bring the United States into the Iraq War. But this is not unique to Iraq in 2003 or Syria in 2017. This is the way that the British have played their imperial game for decades and decades, using the United States as their dumb giant in order to continue to divide the world. That divide and conquer strategy has been a British imperial strategy for centuries, and it's now time that the United States wise up and declare no more. We will not allow ourselves to be used in that way, and in fact, we will embrace a new paradigm of win-win cooperation. Now, the British and their fellow travelers in the United States have certainly been very blatant in their attempts to destabilize, overthrow the Trump administration because they were very afraid that he would follow through on what he said. No more regime change, no more imperialistic wars, and we are going to cooperate with Russia and with China. That was a little bit more complex, but the Russia one was very clear. But as we know, since the summit with President Xi Jinping of China, President Trump and President Xi have had very close relationships, personal relationships, and have been talking very, very regularly. And that channel of communication is crucial, especially with the hot spot now, which has now emerged right on the border of China in the case of North Korea. So we're going to use the case of North Korea as a sort of case study, but in the context of this much broader sense of the showdown over the future of what system will govern the world, imperialistic divide and conquer, or a new win-win paradigm of peace and development. Now, in that context, Mike Billington, our guest here today, has just published a new article, which is a very important article and should be read, very clear, which is titled, and it's a very, I think, provocative title. It asks the question, why is Korea not reunified already? So with that said, I'll introduce Mike and let him summarize a little bit of the context, the current developments, and then the case that he lays out in this article.
Okay, thank you, Matt. In fact, the purpose of this article was to show that the answer to that question is that there is no legitimate reason that Korea is not peaceful and at least on the way to reunification already. and I'll review some of that material here. But let me start. There were some extraordinary developments today, so let me give a short update on the crisis. It has to be noted that this is a very, very serious crisis in the sense that were something like what happened with Syria, where Trump was, as Matthew said, lied to and coerced into carrying out an attack against Syria for absolutely no reason, on totally false intelligence. Were that to happen in Korea, this would not be like an attack on an airbase in Syria. This would be would lead to a total disaster throughout all of East Asia and perhaps even global nuclear war. Whether or not they could take out North Korea's nuclear capacities, North Korea, as I'm sure people know because it's all over the press, they have massive conventional capacity. Their armaments lie a total of 30 miles from the capital, Seoul, this beautiful, developed, advanced city, which could be just absolutely wiped out if there were a war. So this is, and they could possibly, in fact, attack even Japan, let alone U.S. Bases within South Korea. So this would be a move of insanity. The Japanese and South Koreans know this very well. I should point out that our friends in South Korea note that there's no panic in South Korea because they've been through these kinds of things before, and they simply assume that nobody is crazy enough to launch a preemptive attack on North Korea. But because of what happened in Syria, a lot of people, including all of us, were very concerned that the British might pull off another stunt and get Trump to go with this. Now, what happened today is extremely important. Trump himself did an interview with Reuters in which he said on North Korea, he said, we'd love to solve things diplomatically, but it's very difficult. But Xi Jinping is playing a crucial role in this. I believe he's trying very hard. I know he would like to be able to do something. Perhaps it's possible that he can't, but I think he'd like to be able to do something. And then, most extraordinary, he said about Kim Jong-un, the leader in North Korea, the grandson of the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. He said, quote, he's 27 years old. His father dies. He took over a regime. So say what you want. That's not easy, especially at that age. Now, I'm not giving him credit or not giving him credit. I'm just saying it's a very hard thing to do. As to whether or not he's rational, I have no opinion, but I hope he's rational. So this is useful. But he then returned again to the fact that he has very good personal relations with Xi Jinping. I feel that he's doing everything in his power to help us with a big situation. I wouldn't want to be causing difficulty right now for him, and I certainly would want to speak to him first before taking any action. Very useful. And then Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, who chaired a meeting at the UN Security Council this morning of ministers, taking the place of that wacky lady we have in there right now speaking for the U.S. too often. But Tillerson was not wacky, not at all. He was very clear in his presentation to the UN Security Council. He said, for too long, the international community has been reactive in addressing North Korea. Those days must come to an end. Failing to act now on the most pressing security issue in the world may bring catastrophic consequences. Now, what does he mean to act now? The press headlines all over the world are Trump and Tillerson are threatening war on North Korea. They want to act now. It's the end of strategic patience, which was the policy of Obama. But keep in mind, strategic patience was not being patient. It was saying, we will not talk to North Korea. We refuse to talk to North Korea. We simply sit back and constantly increase the sanctions, increase the military buildup around their border until they do what we say, which of course they won't do as long as they're being threatened. So the question is, what does it mean to act now? Does it not mean let's get back to talks, let's negotiate? Now, what does he, and you know, what the president said about Kim Jong-un is a very serious comment. Here's somebody who's in a difficult position. Then Tillerson said the following: our goal is not regime change, nor do we desire to threaten the North Korean people or destabilize the Asia-Pacific region. Since 1995, the U.S. has provided $1.3 billion in aid to North Korea, and we look forward to resuming our contributions once the country dismantles its weapons program. Now, that 1995 is a reference to something called the Agreed Framework, which I'm going to mention when I go through some of the history on this. Even more powerful, Tillerson, in an interview with NPR before he went into the UN Security Council, said the following: "You know, if you listen to the North Koreans, their reason for having nuclear weapons is they believe it is their only pathway to secure the ongoing existence of their regime. We hope to convince them that you do not need these weapons to secure the existence of your regime. We do not seek a collapse of the regime. We do seek an accelerated reunification of the peninsula. We seek a denuclearized Korean peninsula, and China shares this goal with us." Now, these are very positive steps, and it refutes the British headlines and the Washington Post and New York Times headlines that say, you know, get ready, we're going to have a war in Korea. So this, I think, is extremely important. Now, let me go through a bit some of the history of this, because even in my reviewing to write this article, I was a bit astonished that how close we were twice before to having a peaceful relationship in the Korean Peninsula and potentially even being reunified or being on the course to reunified. The key point, I think, is that the British assets in the White House over the last 16 years, Bush and Cheney, and then Obama, who served the British purpose of keeping the world divided east and west, as Matthew was pointing out. The key to doing that was making sure the U.S. did not have good relations with Russia and making sure the U.S. did not have good relations with China. They used the South China Sea, they used Ukraine, they used Syria. All of these really had nothing to do with the South China Sea or Ukraine or Syria. They had to do with preventing any potential for the U.S. and Russia to work together, and the U.S. and China to work together. This is empire. That's the way empire works, to keep the world divided, especially the East-West divide. So let's go back to what Tillerson was referring to in 1995. What happened is that the North Koreans were part of the UN Non-Proliferation Treaty and non-nuclear development agreements, that they wouldn't develop nuclear weapons. And then in the early 90s, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, believed that they were using a small test reactor at Yongbyon. The Yongbyon, it was a graphite moderated reactor which produces plutonium as a side product of producing energy. So they believed that they were hiding the plutonium being produced at the Yongbyon plant and using it to produce weapons. This led to a very, very serious crisis. The Clinton administration and their defense secretary, William Perry, at the time, and I'll mention Perry a couple of times here, were very seriously considering a strategic takeout of the Yongbyon plant. Would that have been as serious as now? I don't think so, but it would have been very, very serious. What happened is quite interesting. The former president, Jimmy Carter, went to North Korea, supposedly on his own. I'm sure this was very carefully worked out with President Bill Clinton. But he went on his own. He met with Kim Il-sung, excuse me, who was still alive at that time, the original head of North Korea. And out of that meeting came to an agreement that they would, through negotiations, come up with an agreement to actually solve the crisis, which they did. It was called the Agreed Framework of 1994. And this was quite extraordinary. The North Koreans agreed to dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear plant and to stop construction on two other plants that also were graphite, could produce plutonium. In exchange, the U.S. built a nuclear plant for North Korea. The U.S. and the South Koreans they began, they didn't get very far, build a large nuclear, 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, but it was going to be a light water reactor that didn't produce fuel for nuclear weapons. It was a safer form of a nuclear plant. In the meantime, they did provide oil until they got the nuclear plant going for heating. They agreed to start negotiations towards a peace agreement. That the U.S. and North Korea are officially still at war. After the Korean War, there was not a peace agreement, but just an armistice to stop the fighting. Officially, there's no peace agreement. We do not have normal relations with North Korea. We're actually in a state of war with North Korea. So clearly, the North Koreans want to have a normal relationship with the U.S., not to be constantly threatened. And that was agreed that it would happen. So this was moving forward quite well. It was slow. There were problems. The U.S. didn't live up to all its agreements, but it was moving forward. And then, extremely important, in 1998, Kim Dae-jung was elected president of South Korea. Kim Dae-jung is a very interesting character. He had been a very, very strong opponent of the military regimes in South Korea. He had been thrown in jail several times. There was a point where he was about to be executed, and the U.S. actually intervened and saved his life at that time. And then by 1998, things had changed. There was more of a move towards getting away from military regimes. They weren't exactly dictatorships. They were elected, but they were military regimes. And Kim Dae-jung was elected. He immediately not only began to democratize domestic policies, but he set up something called the Sunshine Policy, which was, we will work with North Korea on development, on opening up economic collaboration as the basis over the long term to establish peace between us and long-term reunification. So Kim Dae-jung was in power. William Perry, the defense secretary, he had left being defense secretary by that time, but he, in a recent article on this, on his history in all of this, said that towards the end of the Clinton administration, they were working to take that agreement even further, to have the North basically swear that they were giving up all weapons programs in exchange for actually having a peace agreement and setting up normal relations between the two countries. And it was so close that they had actually planned a presidential visit to North Korea, that Clinton would visit North Korea. So unfortunately, as William Perry points out, the Clinton administration ran out and Bush and Cheney came in. Now, you may remember that the defense secretary under Bush and Cheney was Colin Powell, a general, a fairly wise gentleman. He, in his first press conference, said, we intend to engage with North Korea and pick up where Clinton left off. Very important. The next day, Bush, with Cheney behind him and Paul Wolfowitz around, said there will be no engagement with North Korea. They're a dictatorship. That sounds familiar, right? Dictators. We will not talk to them. There will be no engagement. And Colin Powell was basically put in his place. And the whole process began to fall apart, at least in terms of the U.S. Collaborating and playing a key role in collaboration with North and South Korea and Russia and China and Japan. I should mention that back in, well, no, that's a little later. So in any case, Kim Dae-jung and the others, Russia, China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, continued the process. They basically said, okay, that's what Bush and Cheney are saying, but this is the future of our lives, of our country, and really of the world. And they moved forward. And Kim Dae-jung, by 2002, was successful in setting up an extraordinary process. And I should mention here that Lyndon LaRouche's ideas through that period, 2000-2002, were all over South Korea. One of our members, Kathy Wolf, was going back and forth. She was meeting with people in the government, around the government, cultural people in South Korea. And you may remember, 1992 is when Lyndon LaRouche first came up with the idea, at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, that we should build a new Silk Road. We should have a Silk Road which would bridge Europe, Russia, China, and bring them together around a development process by building the new Silk Road, what the Chinese called the Eurasian Land Bridge. So Kim Dae-jung, the South Korean president, built a process he called the Iron Silk Road. And I can assure you there was an influence there. That term didn't come out of nowhere. LaRouche had always said that the new Silk Road should go from Busan to Rotterdam. Busan is on the southern tip of South Korea. that in other words, it had to go through North Korea, through Russia, and also through China into Europe. So this idea of the Iron Silk Road was taking shape. It was taking shape so much. Here, put that first map on,
Yep.
Adam. This is the map. The plan was to reconstruct two rail lines from South Korea into North Korea, which of course had been shut down. There was an armed, demilitarized zone with fences on either side and a no man's land in between. The idea was to build rail connections, as you can see in the map, one of them going through the west that would go up through Pyongyang and then into China, one that would head out towards the west and go up towards Russia into Vladivostok and hit the Trans-Siberian Railway in both directions, actually. And indeed, they began this process. Kim Dae-jung went to the north and met with Kim Jong-il, who was the son of Kim Il-sung, who was in power. Kim Il-sung literally died the year they signed the agreed framework, but his son continued it. So they made this process, they built this process up, and by 2002, they literally opened up the demilitarized zone fences in both of those spots. Both the north-south and the side-south. They cut the DMZ fences. Soldiers from north and south went into the DMZ and began clearing the mines that were all over the place in the DMZ. And they reconstructed the rail line between the two countries. And in 2002, you can show that next slide, you had the extraordinary event of a railroad going across the DMZ, going from South Korea into North Korea, symbolic because there had to be a lot of construction on the rail lines to make them connect all the way through. But as you can see here, they had a big banner in the front, the reunification of the Koreas. This was an extraordinary event, which we reported in EIR at some length. These pictures were in those articles back in 2002. And it wasn't just the railroads. At the same time, Kim Jong-il, or Kim Dae-jung, excuse me, a lot of Kims in Korea. Kim Dae-jung began a industrial park in North Korea, the Kaesong Industrial Park. This was across the border in North Korea with South Korean companies setting up factories in the north with North Korean labor. This grew to the point where recently there were 123 South Korean companies working in the north. This was obviously in the direction of setting up, collaboration between the South Korean industry and the skilled workforce in the north, but very poor. So this was proceeding forward. They also set up six-party talks. Now this, you've probably heard of the six-party talks. This was where Russia, China, Japan, North and South Korea, and the United States began a series of talks to basically try to regroup from the failure, the collapse, the shutdown by Bush and Cheney of the agreed framework. So these meetings began, but I won't go through the details of what happened. It's tedious because every opportunity that Bush and Cheney had to say that the North Koreans were cheating, the North Koreans are lying, you can't trust these vicious dictators, every opportunity they had to sabotage any forward direction. There were some positive agreements made, and if you read the history of it from the U.S. press, it'll say the North Koreans reneged. Well, it wasn't that way. It was sabotaged by Bush and Cheney every chance. It went into the Obama administration, and Obama continued sabotaging it every chance he got. So eventually these fell apart under Obama. Obama then began this so-called strategic patience, which meant no talks, build up your military, impose sanctions. They might have said that the purpose was that they expected the North Korean regime to collapse. But that wasn't it at all. Bush and Cheney and Obama wanted North Korea to build nuclear weapons. Now, why would anybody be so insane as to want North Korea to have nuclear weapons? Well, first of all, they knew that they wouldn't use them or they'd be blown off the face of the map. William Perry, in his recent article, said the North Korean regime is reckless, but they're not crazy. They're not suicidal. If they were to use a nuclear weapon preemptively, they know that the country would be obliterated overnight and their leadership entirely killed. They're not crazy. But why would the West want them to have nuclear weapons? Because the target's not North Korea, it's China. As long as you have this bugaboo of North Korea threatening the world with their nuclear weapons, you can go ahead and build up a massive force around China, the way they were in Europe, where they're building anti-ballistic missiles and moving NATO right up to the Russian border, sending troops, tanks, planes right up to the Russian border, and in Asia, doing the same thing, supposedly to counter North Korea. Most people have read about what's going on with these THAAD missiles, which literally just a couple days ago, they actually set up the THAAD missiles in South Korea, claiming that these are needed for the defense of South Korea against the North. Well, THAAD, this says terminal high altitude missiles. North Korea is 30 miles from Seoul. They don't need to send 8 ICBMs, up into space and back down onto Seoul. The THAAD is useless against North Korea. It may be useless in general, but it's a threat to China and to Russia, because with that you have the X-band radar, which sees deep, deep into Chinese territory and Russian Far East territory, and which thereby gives them an advantage in a potential first strike where they could take out, potentially, they believe, they fantasize, they could take out the counter-strike capacity of China. And the Chinese and the Russians are saying, we're going to have to, this destroys the balance, we're going to have to put something together to counter this. So, the other thing to point out is the obvious fact that North Korea sees very clearly what happened to Iraq, what happened to Libya, two countries that voluntarily gave up their nuclear weapons program with all kinds of praise and promises from the West, although they lied about Iraq. But as soon as they did, their nation was bombed back to the Stone Age, their leaders killed, and the country turned over to warring terrorist forces. So the North Koreans are not crazy, and they're aware that were they to give up their nuclear weapons program preemptively, they'd probably get the same regime change statement, which is why it's so important that Tillerson is saying we are not going for regime change, which is what Trump had said throughout the campaign, that they weren't going to have regime change. They also see that the targeting of China, they're aware of this, is part and parcel of this operation. And you should point out that the Obama administration had this TPP, this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was also a part of the countering of China, the attempt to isolate China, which didn't work. It didn't work largely because the countries there recognized that this was an attack on China, and they absolutely depend upon and appreciate the infrastructure development coming from China through the new Silk Road and the new Maritime Silk Road. So, that's where this stood when, and the last thing I'll bring up here is that the last administration in North Korea, Park Geun-hye, I'm sure everybody's seen that she was recently impeached, thrown out of office. The impeachment was upheld by the Constitutional Court, and there's now an election which is taking place literally in less than 2 weeks from now on May 9th, which makes it all the more absurd that the U.S. deployed this THAAD missile system literally a few days before an election in which the candidates are both against the THAAD missile system. So they rushed this in order to make it, hopefully they think, make it impossible to be reversed. But we'll see. It was a foolish move by the U.S. to ram this through. But in any case, Park Geun-hye started her administration. This is the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who was the brilliant leader who brought Korea out from being one of the poorest nations on earth to being one of the great industrial nuclear power producing and exporting countries in the world. And his daughter, Park Geun-hye, was elected president. But unfortunately, she was elected mostly on her name. However, she began her administration with what she called the Eurasian vision. And this was, in fact, part of the New Silk Road process. She saw, working with Russia and China and Japan, that Korea belonged to Eurasia, which obviously meant it had to work through North Korea. Now, officially, the regime in the South, under her and her predecessor, were not allowed to have relations with North Korea, except for the Kaesong industrial plant. But Park Geun-hye allowed 3 major South Korean companies, Hyundai Merchant Marine, which is their biggest ship company, Korail, which is their state rail company, and POSCO, a huge steel company, to have a consortium with Russia and North Korea, literally a consortium, a business agreement, where the Russians rebuilt a port in the north of North Korea, rebuilt the railroad from Vladivostok down to that port, and they were shipping Russian coal into North Korea, where it was picked up by a South Korean Hyundai ship, shipped to the south, put on South Korean rail, and shipped to South Korean steel mills. So this was, again, like the Kaesong, it was a model for the kind of collaboration which could lead towards long-term economic progress and development and trust, and lead towards a reunification. Then, without going into details, the North Koreans tested, I think it was the fourth of their nuclear tests, which everybody knew was going to happen for the reasons I said. They're not going to give this up unless they can get an honest pledge that there's not going to be a war, a regime change against them. So they did, and unfortunately Park Geun-hye, who was weak, capitulated entirely to Obama, shut everything down, shut down even the Kaesong industrial plant that had been up for 15 years, which killed their own industries. It shut down the Rezone process of the rail, and basically cut off all ties to the North altogether on behalf of Obama, on behalf of a war against China, despite the fact that in 2015 she had gone to Beijing on the 70th anniversary of World War II's victory against the Japanese and the Germans. She'd gone there and stood on the podium with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, the three of them standing together, honoring the war victory. And then she comes back and basically pulls the plug on the whole thing. Now, she wasn't impeached because of that. She was impeached because of a corruption case within South Korea. But I'm certain that this led to the loss of any trust in her, that she'd undermined her own industries, that she'd capitulated to an American policy, that she was going ahead with this THAAD deployment, that she lost the industry, she lost the left factions who were about to win the election, the more liberal side. So this was a real disaster for South Korea and potentially for the world. Now we have Trump, we have Xi Jinping, we have Abe in Japan working very, very closely with Putin, and we're going to have a new regime in South Korea. I won't go into, exactly who these guys are, but in general, both the leading candidates want to work with Russia and China and want to open up better relations with the North. So you have the geometry. If Trump goes with the Silk Road process, you have a geometry which is going to end this last British outpost of destabilization and instability, this North Korea monster, the monster issue. It's not that North Korea is a monster, but this has served the British imperial purpose of keeping the U.S. at a point of conflict with Russia and China. If we can solve that, then all of Asia is now unified, except for the North Korea issue. With the election in the Philippines of Duterte, his rejection of the war policy in the South China Sea, it basically united all the Southeast Asia countries. All 10 of them are now united around working with China, not cutting off ties to the U.S., but working with China. So you have tremendous potential, and it's all really coming down to the next very short period, weeks, months at most. A lot of this is going to be determined in the very, very near term. And as LaRouche has always insisted, to look at any particular crisis like the North Korean crisis, you have to look at it in the context of the entire world, and certainly in the context of the Eurasian potential of the new Silk Road. And I think there's every reason to be confident that some sort of talks are being discussed privately, not just threats, that this is going to move forward in the context of the Silk Road. As Matthew mentioned, if Trump were to go to this meeting on May 14th and 15th, Abe would then probably go from Japan. And there's no question but that we'd have a peace process that would be almost unstoppable, no matter what the British claim they're going to unleash. So this is a very, very great moment in history. A dangerous but potentially great optimism is in hand.
Well, and you can tell that the British are definitely very anxious what could be lurking around the corner for the future of their divide and conquer strategy. And I know we were talking before the show, Mike, about the very appropriate and incisive statements that were made by the um, Russian representative at that meeting at the United Nations Security Council. Here's the quote. This is the Russian Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, Vladimir Safronkov, and he turned to Matthew Rycroft, who is the British Permanent Representative at the United Nations Security Council, and he said the following, quote, "The essence is, and everyone in the United Nations knows this very well, is that you are afraid. You have been losing sleep over the fact that we might be working together with the United States, cooperating with the United States. That is your fear. You are doing everything to make sure that this kind of cooperation be undermined."
This has had a tremendous impact because people know that LaRouche has argued all the last 50 years that the problem is the British Empire. And almost nobody of stature has ever acknowledged that continuing role of the British Empire until this, really. I learned today that Ambassador Rycroft, who was a close ally and advisor to Tony Blair, and was one of the authors of the dodgy dossier which started the Iraq War in the first place. I learned today from our friends in England that Rycroft was meeting today with the head of the White Helmets, the terrorist so-called humanitarian group that works with Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and who provided the fake evidence of Assad carrying out a chemical weapons attack. So this is confirmation that this open collaboration with a terrorist organization funded by the British and functioning to try to start a war in Syria, for which we can and must prevent that in league with this overall fight to bring about the new Silk Road, not a new war.
Let me end with this, and I'll let you respond to it. But I think, as everybody knows, a very significant personality in Korea and that area of the world was the great U.S. General Douglas MacArthur. And in the aftermath of the original Korean War, Douglas MacArthur came back to the United States and he reported back to Congress. And this is a quote from MacArthur's speech to a joint session of Congress in 1951. And I think it gets directly at the much broader point that Helga LaRouche has been making at the present time, and Lyndon LaRouche, about what is really at stake and what is necessary if we're going to move civilization into a new paradigm of survival. This is what Douglas MacArthur said, quote, "Military alliances, balances of power, leagues of nations, all in turn fail, leaving the only path to be by way of the crucible of war. The utter destructiveness of war now blocks out this alternative. We have had our last chance. If we will not devise some greater and more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door. The problem basically is theological and involves a spiritual requiescence, an improvement of human character that will synchronize with our almost matchless advances in science, art, literature, and all material and cultural developments of the past 2,000 years. It must be of the Spirit if we are to save the flesh." So, Mike, you were one of the speakers at the conference that the Schiller Institute sponsored in New York City 2 weeks ago. And the subject of that conference was not only the diplomatic and strategic cooperation which is necessary between the United States and China right now, the United States joining the New Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative, but it was also a dialogue of civilizations, a dialogue of the greatest parts of these two great cultures, European culture and Chinese culture, in a form where Helga LaRouche, in a really profound way, stretching across generations, across centuries, across millennia, really, put the great German poet, the revolutionary poet Friedrich Schiller, and philosopher in dialogue with the poet and philosopher, which really is the basis of all of modern Chinese civilization, Confucius. And that dialogue that she set up between Friedrich Schiller and Confucius, speaking to each other across the span of millennia and across literally two sides of the world, uh, created the kind of image of a mankind, the possibility of a mankind which could emerge if we were to finally put an end to this imperial system of dividing the East and the West and bringing these two great cultures into a dialogue with each other. So you presented at that conference, and maybe just in that context.
Those are available now. The new EIR that came out today has, I think it has Helga's speech, right?
Yes, I think so.
And a speech by Patrick Ho, who's a very good friend of ours from China, from Hong Kong, who is campaigning all over the world for the new Silk Road and has become 3 conferences now we've done together. And he gave a presentation then on Confucian thought and Western thought, but he in that presentation, he showed a very, very serious problem, which I had addressed over my long years on sabbatical leave in prison, where I studied extensively the Chinese culture and the relationship between Confucian culture and the Western Christian Renaissance. And Patrick didn't take up that challenge for this speech. So he gave a speech which fell prey to exactly what I then spoke about, and that speech is also in the EIR this week, or you can watch it on the Schiller Institute website. But it's very important because what I learned in studying this is that the British set about, as they do in every colony that they took over, in profiling the backward tendencies within that culture and then grasping those backward tendencies that want to stay primitive, stay backwards, and defining those to be the natural ideology of that country. And in the case of China, they recognized that Confucianism was a very great threat to their ability to control and keep China backwards, because it's a vision like Platonism in the West, and as Helga had brilliantly shown, like the Renaissance thinking in Europe, that professed progress. It valued the mind of the individual as that which made him human. It's the creative power of the human mind, and against that, the British said, no, Confucianism is keeping you backwards because it's formal and it's structured. You have to go back to the roots of Taoism, which basically tells the peasant that he's a happy peasant. He's happy not knowing about science and technology. Stay backwards, or the so-called legalist ideology, which was punishment and reward. You treat people like animals. You punish them or reward them the way you do a dog to make them do what you want them to do. So the unfortunate reality is that the British deployed their top guns, especially Bertrand Russell, into China, especially when Sun Yat-sen came along promoting the American system. They sent Bertrand Russell in to poison that system, to denounce Confucianism, to promote the happy peasant, and the Taoist ideology. And unfortunately, this was deeply ingrained into the Chinese culture, so that even today, Xi Jinping, who is fighting to bring that country forward, is faced with this kind of thought in China. And what they presented to the Chinese as Western thought, so-called, was not Leibniz and Schiller and Nicholas of Cusa, the people that gave us the Renaissance, who gave rise to modern science, but rather they said, we, the British, defeated you because we have wealth and power. How do we have wealth and power? It's that we believe in Darwinianism, social Darwinism, that the strong must crush the weak. And that's the way you get strong. So if you want to be strong, then you should be like us and believe that Western thought, i.e. British empirical anti-human thought, is what you should aspire to. So I won't go into more details, but I encourage you to read it, because these are fundamental debates. This question of how can we create a Renaissance which crosses every great culture? Because every great culture has great moments and bad moments, bad tendencies, weak tendencies, and strong tendencies that aspire, that one which honors the human creative power, the other that tries to keep people enslaved as master and slave. And we have to pull out the best of every culture throughout the world: Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Confucianism, the Muslim tradition of the Baghdad Caliphate. All of these are there. The Indian Gupta period. We can pull these together and have a Renaissance which is not this part of the world as opposed to that part of the world, but is truly universal, of man with a common aim for mankind, as Helga likes to say. And this is within our grasp. That this could truly be the end of war for all mankind. People say, "Oh, that's naive, because human nature is warlike." Well, human nature is not. Human nature is creative. It's the bestial imposition of this backward ideology on peoples which leads to wars. If we had a true global Renaissance based on science and technology and great culture, great music, there's no reason to think that we could not end the scourge of war once and for all, as that beautiful quote, which I'd never heard from Douglas MacArthur, clearly indicates. These are philosophic and theological issues, but they're within our grasp today. This is what the LaRouche movement has been about from its inception, and it's now literally within our grasp.
Well, thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
We have this material is available. Mike's article is going to be published. This is in the Executive Intelligence Review and be made available through LaRouchePAC as well. And as Mike said, all of the proceedings of that conference, the Schiller Institute conference in New York, are also available. LaRouchePAC also made a video a couple of years ago on the question of the reunification of Korea and some of these initiatives from the 1990s and these unification efforts. So we'll make that video also available. It'll be linked in the description of this video. But I think that's a wonderful discussion, and it's extraordinarily valuable for people to have this view, this depth of background, but also the vision of what is possible. And, Douglas MacArthur's point that in essence, this is a spiritual, this is a theological question. Will mankind come to know himself as a creative species, and will we change the way that man views himself, which is what is necessary if we are to survive? And the vehicle for doing that are these types of win-win development projects. That's the true name of peace. So I think we have a wonderful microcosm in what we just used as a case study in the case of Korea, but this type of thinking is what is so urgently necessary for the entire world. And that's absolutely the value of what the LaRouche movement has done over the last several decades and continues to represent on this planet today. So thank you, Mike, and thank you all for tuning in, and please stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com.